The resort still operates on schedule. Lights illuminate empty corridors every evening. Pools are filtered daily, despite no one swimming. Air-conditioned lobbies echo with footsteps that never arrive. Staff entrances open and close, even when no guests are checked in. Nothing here is broken, nothing is unfinished, nothing is decaying. This resort was delivered on time, on budget, and exactly as promised. Every system works, every amenity functions, every cost was anticipated. And yet, from the moment it opened, it began losing money. Not because it failed to attract guests, not because it was poorly designed, but because keeping it alive cost more than it could ever earn. So the real question isn't why this resort closed. The question is more unsettling. Can something be too perfect and still be economically impossible to exist? Every design decision here was meant to prevent failure. The planning phase consumed 3 years. Consultants were retained from hospitality firms that advised Four Seasons and Ritz-Carlton. Market studies predicted demand. Financial models projected revenue. Architects designed for maximum efficiency. Every choice was vetted, tested, and approved by committees whose sole mandate was risk mitigation. The location itself was selected through algorithmic analysis. Coastal access for yacht arrivals, proximity to an international airport, exactly 47 minutes by car. Climate data showing 310 days of suitable weather annually. Demographic studies confirming a wealthy population within a 4-hour flight radius. The resort would offer 280 rooms across multiple buildings, 3 restaurants, each with a distinct culinary concept. A spa occupying 15,000 square feet. 2 pools, 1 Olympic length for serious swimmers, 1 infinity edge for photographs. Tennis courts surfaced in 3 different materials to accommodate guest preference. A private beach with imported sand, grain size selected for optimal barefoot comfort. Construction. Specifications were extraordinary. Hurricane-rated glass throughout. Backup generators capable of running the entire property for 72 hours. Water treatment systems that could operate independently of municipal supply. Materials chosen not for cost, but for durability measured in decades. The budget was set at $120 million, high but justified. This would not be a resort that cut corners. This would be a property that delivered flawless luxury from day one and maintained it indefinitely. What no one questioned deeply enough was whether perfection and profitability could coexist at this scale. The assumption, never spoken but universally held, was simple. Build it right, and guests will come. Build it beautiful, and they will pay. Build it perfect, and it will succeed. That assumption was wrong. This wasn't a gamble made by individuals. It was approved by committees. The development group was structured as a limited partnership. The lead investor was a real estate fund, specializing in luxury hospitality. Secondary investors included a pension fund, a family office managing inherited wealth, and a sovereign wealth fund from a Gulf state seeking diversification beyond oil. None of these entities were reckless. All employed experienced analysts. Due diligence was thorough. Market studies came from recognized firms. Financial projections were modeled conservatively, or so everyone believed. The pitch was compelling. Luxury travel was growing globally. High net worth individuals were increasing in number. Experiential spending was rising. Competitors in nearby markets were consistently sold out during peak seasons. There was, the consultants assured, unmet demand. Lending institutions participated eagerly. Construction financing came from a consortium of banks. The loan-to-value ratio was reasonable at 65%. The interest rate reflected confidence in the project. Lenders believed the asset, once operational, would generate sufficient cash flow to service debt comfortably. Brand consultants were engaged to position the resort. It would not compete on price. It would compete on experience. The target guest was not merely wealthy. but discerning. Someone who valued service, design, and exclusivity. Someone willing to pay premium rates for premium delivery. Every approval checkpoint was cleared. Environmental permits, zoning variances, construction contracts, operating agreements with a management company experienced in running 5-star properties, insurance policies covering every conceivable risk. On paper, the project was bulletproof. The flaw was not in any single decision. The flaw was in the cumulative weight of decisions that, individually rational, created an operational structure too expensive to sustain. Nobody set out to build something impossible. But in trying to eliminate all risk, they created a new one, the risk of perfection itself. The numbers worked until they started running every day. Construction came in on budget. The resort opened on schedule in the spring, positioned to capture the beginning of high season. Early reviews were glowing. Design publications featured the architecture. Travel writers praised the service. Guest satisfaction scores were exceptional. Revenue exceeded initial projections. Occupancy during the first 6 months averaged 68%. Average daily rate was $850, well above the market average. The restaurants attracted non-guests, generating additional income. The spa was consistently booked. Yet the financials told a different story. Monthly operating statements revealed a gap. Revenue was strong, expenses were stronger. The property was losing approximately $400,000 per month. Management initially dismissed this as normal for a new property. Ramp-up costs were expected. Efficiencies would improve. Occupancy would climb. The gap would close. It did not close. It widened. The problem was rooted in the resort's design. Luxury required staff ratios that made labor costs inflexible. Every 10 rooms required approximately 4 full-time employees. Front desk, housekeeping, maintenance, food and beverage, groundskeeping, security, management. The total headcount exceeded 320. Payroll consumed 48% of revenue. Industry standards suggested 35% was sustainable, but reducing staff meant reducing service. Reducing service meant abandoning the luxury positioning that justified premium rates. Utilities were the second pressure point. Climate control for 280 rooms, multiple restaurants, a spa, and public spaces demanded enormous energy. The resort's monthly electricity bill averaged $180,000. Water, particularly for pools, landscaping, and laundry, added another $40,000. Maintenance costs, anticipated at 4% of revenue, ran closer to 7%. High-end finishes required specialized care. Saltwater air corroded metal fixtures faster than projected. Landscaping, designed to look effortlessly tropical, demanded constant intervention. Insurance premiums were substantial. Hurricane coverage alone cost $35,000 monthly. Liability insurance for a property with pools, a beach, water sports, and dining added another $20,000. Property taxes reflected the assessed value of a $120 million asset. The annual bill exceeded $2 million. Debt service, the monthly payment to lenders, was fixed at $620,000. This was the floor, the unmovable cost that had to be met regardless of occupancy or revenue. When all costs were tallied, the resort needed to generate approximately $1.8 million monthly just to break even. That required an average occupancy of 75% at an average rate of $900. Achieving 75% occupancy year-round in a seasonal market was already ambitious. Sustaining $900 rates required flawless execution and limited competition. Neither condition held indefinitely. In luxury resorts, standing still is the most expensive option. Guests at this tier expect not just quality but novelty. Returning, visitors want to see improvements, new amenities, refreshed design, experiences they did not have on their last stay. Competitors were not idle. A rival property 40 miles north completed a $15 million renovation, adding villas with private plunge pools. Another resort to the south launched a partnership with a celebrity chef, generating media attention and bookings. Standing still meant falling behind, so the resort reinvested. A beachfront bar was added at a cost of $800,000. The spa introduced a new treatment menu, requiring specialized equipment and additional training. Guest rooms were refreshed with new linens, upgraded technology, and redesigned bathrooms. Each improvement was individually justified. Each was expensive. Cumulatively, they deepened the financial strain. The luxury segment also demanded constant perfection in daily operations. A single negative review could damage reputation. One instance of poor service could cost repeat business. So standards remained rigid. Flowers were changed every 3 days. Linens were replaced, not just laundered after a certain number of uses. Food ingredients were sourced from premium suppliers, even when cheaper alternatives were available. Staff training was continuous. This was not wasteful. This was necessary to maintain brand positioning. But necessary does not mean affordable. The resort's marketing budget reflected the same tension. Luxury properties do not advertise in the same channels as mid-market hotels. Placement in high-end travel publications was expensive. Hosting travel influencers and journalists cost thousands per visit. Digital marketing targeting affluent demographics required sophisticated, costly campaigns. Every dollar spent on marketing had to generate more than $1 in bookings. The return on investment was positive, but marginal. A $50,000 campaign might generate $75,000 in incremental revenue. Profitable, but not transformative. The fundamental issue remained unchanged. The resort was designed to operate at a level of quality that cost more than the market would reliably pay. Excellence, it turned out, was expensive, and in this case, it was unsustainable. The resort was staffed for crowds that never needed to arrive. Luxury service standards dictated staffing levels independent of occupancy. A 5-star property required full coverage across all departments, even during low season when rooms sat empty. The front desk needed personnel around the clock. 3 shifts, minimum 2 employees per shift, plus a manager. That alone consumed 20 full-time positions. Housekeeping was calculated by room inventory, not occupied rooms. With 280 rooms, the department employed 70 housekeepers, supervisors, and laundry staff. During a week when occupancy dropped to 40%, half the staff had reduced workloads, but remained on payroll. Food and beverage was the most labor-intensive division. 3 restaurants required full kitchen brigades. Cooks, sous chefs, prep workers, dishwashers. Front-of-house staff included servers, bartenders, hosts, sommeliers. Even when a restaurant served only a dozen guests, it needed a full team to maintain service standards. The spa employed 18 therapists, receptionists, and attendants. On days when appointments were sparse, therapists were paid to wait. Groundskeeping and maintenance ran continuously. Landscaping crews started at dawn, trimming, planting, irrigating. Pools were serviced daily. HVAC systems were monitored. Repairs were addressed immediately. Security operated 24/7. Guards patrolled the grounds, monitored cameras, and managed access points. A minimum of 4 guards were on duty at all times. Management overhead included a general manager, assistant managers, department heads, human resources, accounting, sales, and marketing. These positions were salaried and fixed. The total payroll, including benefits and payroll taxes, exceeded $900,000 monthly. During a month when revenue was $1.4 million, labor consumed 64%. Unsustainable by any industry standard. Attempts to adjust staffing met resistance. Reducing headcount lowered service quality. Guests noticed. Online reviews mentioned slower check-ins, delayed room service, less attentive pool service. Ratings declined, bookings softened. Management tried cross-training. Front desk staff were trained to assist with guest services. Maintenance workers were taught basic groundskeeping. Efficiencies were gained, but they were marginal. The core problem remained structural. The resort was built for a level of service that required a workforce larger than the revenue base could support. In a different market segment, labor could flex with demand. At a budget hotel, night shifts ran with skeleton crews. Housekeeping was scheduled around occupancy. Food service was outsourced or simplified. But luxury does not flex. Luxury is the promise of abundance. And abundance is expensive to staff. Utilities didn't scale down. They stayed massive. The resort's energy consumption was staggering. HVAC systems ran continuously. In summer, air conditioning fought tropical heat and humidity. In winter, heating ensured guest comfort during cooler evenings. There was no off-season for climate control. Each guest room contained individually controlled thermostats. Guests set temperatures to personal preference. Rooms left vacant were still climate-controlled to prevent mustiness and mold. Public spaces, the lobby, restaurants, ballrooms, were maintained at precise temperatures. Commercial kitchens generated enormous heat, requiring powerful ventilation and additional cooling. The spa's treatment rooms needed consistent warmth. The fitness center stayed cool for comfort during exercise. 2 pools required heating year-round to maintain optimal temperatures. Pumps circulated water constantly. Filtration systems ran 24 hours. Chemical balances were monitored and adjusted multiple times daily. Lighting alone consumed massive power. The resort's aesthetic relied on abundant illumination. Pathways, gardens, building facades, all were lit for ambiance and safety. Lights operated on timers, some on motion sensors, but the baseline load was high. The laundry facility, processing thousands of pounds of linens weekly, ran industrial washers and dryers that drew heavy current. Water heating for laundry, kitchens, and guest bathrooms required dedicated boilers. Backup generators, mandatory for maintaining operations during power outages, were tested weekly. Fuel costs for these tests and for actual emergency use added another layer of expense. Monthly electricity bills averaged $180,000. Efforts to reduce this through LED retrofits, more efficient HVAC units, and solar panels helped marginally. A $1.2 million investment in solar infrastructure reduced the power bill by approximately $18,000 monthly. The payback period was 67 months, longer than most investors were willing to wait. Water consumption was equally problematic. The resort used approximately 800,000 gallons monthly. Pools accounted for a significant portion, through evaporation, backwashing filters, and routine drainage for maintenance. Landscaping, designed with tropical plants that required generous irrigation, consumed another large share. Kitchens used water for cooking, cleaning, and ice production. Guest bathrooms averaged 80 gallons per occupied room per day. Laundry consumed 3 gallons per pound of fabric processed. Water bills, including sewer charges, averaged $40,000 monthly. In regions with water scarcity or rising utility rates, this was a cost with no downward trajectory. Sustainability initiatives were explored. Low-flow fixtures were installed. Drought-tolerant landscaping was introduced in phases. Guests were encouraged to reuse towels. These measures helped, but the scale of the operation ensured that utility costs remained a heavy burden. The fundamental issue was size. A smaller resort could reduce energy and water use proportionally. But at 280 rooms with extensive amenities, baseline consumption was locked in by design. Turning off sections of the resort to save money was considered. It did not help. Shutting down sections didn't reduce costs, it exposed them. During low season, management decided to close one of the 3 accommodation buildings. 50 rooms would go dark. Guests would be concentrated in the remaining buildings. The hope was clear: reduce housekeeping, cut climate control, save on utilities. The savings were disappointing. Housekeeping costs fell, but not proportionally. The department still required supervisors, laundry staff, and a core team for the occupied buildings. The reduction was 12 positions out of 70. Monthly payroll fell by $32,000. Not nothing, but insufficient. Climate control could not be eliminated entirely. Empty buildings in humid coastal climates develop mold within weeks. HVAC systems were set to minimal operation, maintaining air circulation and humidity control. Energy savings were approximately $8,000 monthly. Maintenance, paradoxically, increased. Unoccupied buildings deteriorated faster. Plumbing seals dried out. Insects and small animals found entry points. Salt air corroded metal fixtures without the regular cleaning that occupied rooms received. Repairs deferred during closure cost more when addressed later. Guests noticed the closures. The resort felt emptier. Restaurants were quieter. The pool area lacked energy. Reviews mentioned a deserted atmosphere. Some guests questioned whether the property was in financial trouble. Perception mattered. Luxury is, in part, theatre. The illusion of abundance and vitality is essential. A half-empty resort reads as struggling, not exclusive. Bookings softened further as word spread. The larger issue was systemic. The resort's costs were not proportional to occupancy. They were proportional to capacity. Fixed costs, property taxes, insurance, debt service, management salaries remained unchanged regardless of how many rooms were occupied or closed. Variable costs, those that moved with guest volume, were a smaller share of total expenses than management had anticipated. A resort at 40% occupancy did not cost 40% less to operate than one at 80% occupancy. It cost approximately 75% as much. This is the core challenge of high fixed cost businesses. Airlines face the same math. A plane flying half full still incurs most of the same costs as a full plane. Fuel, crew, maintenance, landing fees. The only significant variable cost is food and beverage. Resorts, especially luxury resorts, are similar. The building exists, the staff exists, the systems run. Turning off pieces does not unlock savings proportional to the reduction. Management learned this lesson expensively. Closing sections saved approximately $40,000 monthly. But the resort was losing $400,000 monthly. The intervention was a rounding error. The problem required a different solution. But what solution works when the fundamental cost structure is misaligned with revenue potential? Raising prices scared demand. Lowering prices broke the model. Consultants were brought in to analyze pricing strategy. Their recommendation was straightforward: increase rates. The resort was underpriced relative to its quality. Guests were willing to pay more. Capture that willingness. Rates were raised by 15%. The new average daily rate was $975. Early results were positive. Revenue per occupied room climbed. Guests who booked appeared unbothered by the increase. But occupancy fell. The drop was gradual, then accelerating. Business travelers, already a small segment, disappeared almost entirely. Leisure travelers, especially younger, affluent guests, shifted to competitors with lower rates. Within 6 months, occupancy had fallen from 68% to 54%. The revenue gain from higher rates was more than offset by the occupancy decline. Total monthly revenue fell by $120,000. Management reversed course. Rates were reduced not to the original level, but to $875. Occupancy stabilized but did not recover to prior levels. The brand had been damaged. Guests who felt the property was overpriced during the increase did not return when rates fell. Dynamic pricing was attempted next. Rates would flex with demand, higher during peak periods, lower during off-season. This is standard practice in hospitality. The results were mixed. Peak season rates of $100 to $200 generated strong revenue, but only during short windows. Off-season rates dropped to $650 to stimulate bookings. Occupancy improved during slow periods, but profit margins collapsed. At $650, the resort barely covered variable costs, let alone fixed expenses. The pricing floor became clear. Below approximately $800 per night, the resort was better off leaving rooms empty. The marginal cost of hosting a guest, housekeeping, utilities, food and beverage, amenities, consumed most of the revenue. There was little contribution to fixed costs, yet the market was increasingly reluctant to pay $800. Competition intensified. New properties opened with aggressive introductory pricing. Online travel agencies applied pressure to discount. Guests, empowered by price comparison tools, shopped relentlessly. Packaging was tried. Inclusive rates bundled meals, spa credits, and activities. This simplified the guest experience and created perceived value. But the economics were unchanged. The resort still needed to generate sufficient revenue to cover costs. Bundling merely obscured the price, it did not change the math. Ultimately, pricing could not solve a cost structure problem. If it costs $1.8 million monthly to operate, and the market will only support rates that generate $1.4 million monthly, no pricing strategy bridges that gap. The consultants left. Their invoices were paid. The problem remained. Even full rooms wouldn't have saved it. A financial analyst ran a scenario. What if the resort achieved 100% occupancy every day of the year at the optimal rate of $900 per night? The calculation was straightforward. 280 rooms at $900 per night for 365 days equals $92 million in annual room revenue. Add food and beverage, spa, and other ancillary revenue. Total estimated revenue, $115 million annually. Operating expenses based on actual data totaled $108 million annually when running at full capacity. That included payroll, utilities, maintenance, insurance, property taxes, and supplies. Debt service added $7.4 million annually. Total obligations, $115.4 million. At 100% occupancy and optimal pricing, the resort would lose $400,000 annually. And 100% occupancy was fantasy. No resort achieves that. Industry best-in-class for luxury properties is approximately 80%. At 80% occupancy with all other assumptions held constant, annual revenue fell to approximately $95 million. The loss widened to $20 million annually. At the actual occupancy rate of 60%, the loss exceeded $35 million annually. The conclusion was inescapable. The resort, as designed and operated, could not generate sufficient revenue to cover its costs. The gap was not operational, it was structural. This realization arrived approximately 18 months after opening. By that point, investor equity had been largely consumed. Cash reserves were depleting. Lenders were monitoring covenants nervously. Management presented the analysis to the ownership group. The room was silent. Someone asked the obvious question, what are the options? The options were limited. 1. Continue operating and accept ongoing losses, funded by additional equity injections. This required investors willing to absorb tens of millions in further losses with no clear path to profitability. 2. Sell the property. But to whom? And at what price? A distressed asset losing money attracts only bargain hunters. The likely sale price would not cover outstanding debt. 3. Close the resort, cease operations, and liquidate. This would trigger default on the loans. Lenders would seize the asset. Investors would lose everything. 4. Restructure. Negotiate with lenders to reduce debt service. This required convincing banks to accept losses on their loans. Difficult, but possible in bankruptcy. None of these options were good. All involved substantial losses. The only question was who would bear them. Slowly, understanding settled over the group. The resort had not failed operationally. It had succeeded operationally while failing financially. It delivered on its promise to guests. It simply could not deliver returns to investors. The dream was too expensive. The math was immovable. There was no crisis meeting, just a gradual acceptance. Ownership discussions became subdued. The initial optimism, the belief that operational improvements would turn things around, faded. Spreadsheets were revisited. Consultants delivered reports. Every analysis arrived at the same conclusion. Conversations shifted from, "How do we fix this?" to, "How do we exit this?" The general manager, a hospitality veteran with decades of experience, tried everything in his toolkit: cost reductions, revenue initiatives, partnerships with tour operators, corporate group sales. Nothing moved the needle significantly. Staff sensed the shift. Morale declined. Uncertainty spread. Turnover increased. Replacing trained employees with new hires added inefficiency and cost. Guest experience suffered subtly. Service remained professional, but the energy changed. A resort is, in many ways, a living organism. When the organism is stressed, guests feel it, even if they cannot articulate why. Reviews remained positive but included small complaints. Slow check-in. A maintenance issue not resolved promptly. A restaurant out of a menu item. Individually minor, cumulatively damaging. Investors grew impatient. Conference calls became tense. Some wanted to double down, invest more, and outlast the rough period. Others wanted to cut losses immediately. Consensus was elusive. Lenders applied pressure. Loan covenants required minimum debt service coverage ratios. The resort was in violation. Banks issued notices of default. Negotiations began. Bankruptcy attorneys were consulted quietly. Restructuring options were explored. The goal was to preserve as much value as possible while minimizing damage. Local media began reporting on the resort's struggles. Speculation spread. Employees worried about their jobs. Vendors worried about unpaid invoices. The realization settled in slowly, like twilight. This was not a temporary setback. This was a fundamental mismatch between what the property cost to operate and what the market would pay. Attempts to redesign the model were considered. Convert to condominiums, transform into a private club, lease to a hotel brand willing to take on operations. Each idea was analyzed and discarded. Conversion costs were prohibitive. Club membership sales were uncertain. Hotel brands, after reviewing the financials, declined to take operational risk. By the third year, the inevitability was clear. The resort would close. Not because of scandal or disaster. Not because of poor service or bad design. Simply because the numbers, unchangeable and patient, had delivered their verdict. Saving it required admitting it should never operate. Additional capital could have extended operations. Investors had resources. The question was whether deploying those resources made sense. The analysis was brutal. Every dollar invested would be lost. There was no scenario, realistic or optimistic, where the resort became self-sustaining. Pouring money in merely delayed the inevitable while increasing total losses. Sunk cost fallacy was discussed. The tendency to continue investing in a failing project because of prior investment is a well-known cognitive bias. Several investors recognized this. One investor, a family office managing generational wealth, commissioned an independent review. The findings were clear. Cease operations, negotiate with lenders, and minimize further loss. Others resisted emotionally. They had believed in the vision. They had approved the project. Admitting failure felt personal. Ultimately, financial discipline prevailed. The partnership voted to cease funding operations. Without additional equity, the resort could not meet payroll or vendor obligations beyond 60 days. Lenders, aware that continued operation was unprofitable, did not object. Their interest was asset preservation. not operations. An empty, maintained building held more value than one burning cache. A closure plan was developed. Guests with future reservations were notified and offered alternatives. Employees were given notice and severance packages. Vendors were paid outstanding balances where possible. The shutdown was orderly. No drama, no last-minute rescues. Just a quiet wind-down. The final guest checked out on a Tuesday afternoon. The staff gathered for a brief meeting. The general manager thanked them for their work. Severance checks were distributed. By evening, the building was empty. Investors absorbed losses totaling approximately $95 million. Lenders, through foreclosure, took possession of the asset and eventually sold it for $48 million to a buyer who converted it to fractional ownership residences. The total destruction of value, from construction cost to liquidation price, exceeded $70 million. Every participant lost. Investors lost capital, lenders took haircuts, employees lost jobs, the community lost tax revenue and economic activity. No one could identify a single catastrophic mistake. The failure was cumulative, 1,000 small decisions that individually seemed reasonable but collectively created an unsustainable structure. In hindsight, the error was clear. They built something perfect for a market that could not afford perfection at that scale. Once operating stops, the asset becomes an expense line. An empty resort still incurs costs. Property taxes continue. Insurance premiums are due. Security is necessary to prevent vandalism and theft. Basic maintenance prevents deterioration. The lender, now the owner through foreclosure, faced these costs monthly. Approximately $85,000 per month to maintain an idle property generating zero revenue. Attempts to sell moved slowly. The buyer pool for a luxury resort in foreclosure is small. Most hotel operators reviewed the financials and declined. The numbers that failed the original owners would fail the next owner under similar operations. The property sat vacant for 14 months. During that time, deferred maintenance accumulated. The tropical climate was unforgiving. Salt air corroded fixtures. Humidity bred mold. Landscaping overgrew. Marketing emphasized potential, not history. The asset was pitched as a conversion opportunity. Condominiums, timeshares, a wellness retreat. Anything but a traditional resort. A buyer emerged offering $48 million. The structure would be converted to fractional ownership. Units would be sold to individuals who would own specific weeks. A management company would handle operations and rentals. The lender accepted. The loss was significant but final. Holding the asset longer only accumulated additional carry costs. The conversion required substantial investment. Interiors were reconfigured. Legal structures were established. Sales and marketing campaigns were launched. Fractional ownership units sold slowly. The market was skeptical. Many potential buyers were aware of the property's troubled history. Others questioned the long-term viability of fractional models. Eventually, enough units sold to make the conversion financially viable for the new owner. The property resumed operations under a different model with different economics. Annual operating costs were lower. Ownership was distributed. Risk was spread. The model worked because it did not attempt the same level of service or operational intensity. The lesson was clear. The building was never the problem. The operational model was the problem. A structure can be beautiful, functional, and well located, yet still fail if the business model underneath it is unsustainable. The resort, in its original form, demanded perfection. Perfection demanded costs the market could not support. When perfection was abandoned, viability returned. Nothing collapsed. The spreadsheet simply won. The resort's closure was orderly, professional, and quiet. There was no emergency, no fraud, no scandal. Just a business that could not cover its costs. In many ways, this made the failure more unsettling. If the resort had been mismanaged, the answer would be clear. Better management. If it had been poorly designed, the answer would be better design. But management was competent. Design was exceptional. Service was outstanding. Every operational metric except profitability was strong. This was a clean failure. A failure of assumptions, not execution. The assumption that luxury demand was deep enough to support pricing that covered costs. The assumption that operational efficiencies would materialize at scale. The assumption that a well-designed, well-located asset would inherently succeed. All of these assumptions were tested. All failed. The closure prompted reflection among participants. Investors reviewed their due diligence process. What signals were missed? What questions were not asked? Lenders examined their underwriting standards. What financial metrics should have triggered concern earlier? Consultants reconsidered their market models. What variables were underweighted? What risks were not adequately surfaced? The answers were uncomfortable. The failure was predictable, but only in retrospect. At the time of approval, the data supported the decision. The models projected success. Hindsight is not replicable. Future projects would face similar uncertainties. Data would support decisions. Some would succeed. Others would fail. The question was whether the industry would learn from this failure or dismiss it as an outlier. Early indications were mixed. Some developers became more cautious, questioning luxury projects with high fixed costs. Others continued building, confident their project would be different. The resort story began appearing in case studies at business schools. MBA students analyzed the financials, debated the decisions, and proposed alternatives. None of the alternatives, when stress-tested, were clearly superior. The conclusion most reached: the project should not have been built. Not because of incompetence, but because the economic fundamentals were unfavorable from the start. Luxury at this scale requires either captive demand, such as a resort tied to a major theme park, or pricing power far beyond what the market demonstrated. Without those conditions, the cost structure overwhelms revenue potential. The resort closed without drama. The building stood. The systems functioned. The design remained beautiful. But the spreadsheet, indifferent to beauty, had delivered its verdict. A new owner inherits the same math. Several potential buyers toured the property during the sale process. Hotel brands, private equity firms, real estate developers. All arrived with consultants, analysts, and optimism. All departed without making offers that satisfied the lender's minimum price. The issue was consistent. Running the property as a traditional luxury resort meant inheriting the same cost structure that defeated the original owners. New ownership did not change utility costs. It did not reduce staffing requirements. It did not eliminate debt service. One potential buyer proposed reducing service levels to cut costs. Fewer staff, limited restaurant hours, reduced amenities. The consultants modeling this scenario concluded that guest satisfaction would decline, occupancy would fall, and the resort would still lose money, just at a slower rate. Another buyer considered a budget repositioning. Convert the resort to a mid-market property. Lower rates, accept higher occupancy at lower margins. This idea failed on inspection. The property was designed for luxury. Marble bathrooms, high-end furnishings, expansive layouts. Retrofitting for budget operations was expensive and wasteful. The building's DNA was luxury. Fighting that DNA made no economic sense. A third buyer explored fractional ownership, the model that eventually succeeded. This required legal restructuring, unit reconfiguration, and a different operational approach. Significant investment was needed before the first unit could be sold. The eventual buyer negotiated the purchase price down to $48 million, less than half the construction cost. Even at that price, the fractional conversion required an additional $12 million investment. The total acquisition and conversion cost of $60 million was still $60 million less than the original construction budget. This discount was necessary to make the new model viable. The math demonstrated a hard truth. The resort, as originally conceived, destroyed value. Approximately $60 million in value was erased through design choices that prioritized luxury over sustainability. Could the property have been built differently? Could a $70 million resort have succeeded where a $120 million resort failed? Perhaps, but that was not the resort that was approved. Committees signed off on perfection. Lenders financed excellence. Investors funded luxury without compromise. The market, indifferent to intention, would only pay what it would pay. A new owner with a different model could succeed, but that success would be built on the ruins of the original vision. Purchased at a discount that represented the cost of learning an expensive lesson, luxury resorts are failing for this exact reason worldwide. The pattern is not isolated. Similar stories have played out across different markets, different countries, different brands. What appeared to be a singular miscalculation is revealing itself as a systemic problem embedded in how luxury hospitality projects are conceived, financed, and executed. A resort in the Caribbean, built for $95 million, closed after 3 years. The property occupied a pristine beach on a lesser-known island. The developers believed they could create demand through quality alone. Occupancy never exceeded 58%. Operating losses exceeded $2 million monthly. Investors injected additional capital twice before accepting defeat. The property was eventually acquired by a hotel chain that repositioned it as an all-inclusive resort at half the original room rates. A mountain resort in the Alps, designed for ultra-luxury guests, filed for bankruptcy 18 months after opening. The building was stunning, a contemporary interpretation of Alpine architecture featuring floor-to-ceiling glass, heated stone floors, and a spa that rivaled any in Europe. The issue was identical. Costs exceeded revenue at every occupancy level tested. Winter season performed adequately, but the 8-month shoulder and summer seasons could not generate sufficient revenue. The property sat vacant for 2 years before being converted into fractional ownership residences. A beach resort in Southeast Asia, backed by sovereign wealth, struggled for 5 years before being sold at a 60% loss. The government had viewed the project as a catalyst for regional tourism development. An entire island was developed with infrastructure, an airstrip, employee housing, and desalination plants. The resort itself was only one component of a much larger investment. When occupancy consistently underperformed, the government continued funding operations to avoid the political embarrassment of failure. Eventually, financial pragmatism prevailed. The new owner converted it to a private members club, eliminating the need to attract transient guests and dramatically reducing marketing costs. Each property shared common features: exceptional design that won architectural awards, high construction costs that reflected premium materials and finishes, ambitious service standards that required extensive staffing, and operational losses that no amount of management skill could eliminate. Industry conferences began addressing the pattern by the mid-2010s. Panels discussed luxury feasibility. Consultants offered frameworks for stress-testing high-end projects. Lenders tightened underwriting standards, requiring more conservative occupancy projections and debt service coverage ratios. Yet projects continued to be approved at a steady pace. The belief that this one will be different remained strong. Developers pointed to successful luxury resorts as proof the model worked. The Amanyara Properties, the Six Senses portfolio, the Ritz-Carlton Reserve Collection. These brands demonstrated that luxury could be profitable. What was rarely examined closely was why those properties succeeded. Location mattered enormously. A resort in the Maldives faced limited competition due to geographic isolation. A property in Bhutan benefited from government restrictions that limited tourist arrivals and prevented competition. Brand strength provided pricing power that independent resorts could not match. And it does work in specific circumstances. Resorts in destinations with limited competition due to geographic or regulatory barriers. Properties with unique natural assets that cannot be replicated, such as cliffside locations or private islands. Brands with loyalty so strong that pricing power is nearly unlimited, supported by decades of reputation building and global distribution networks. But these conditions are rare. Most luxury resort projects face meaningful competition within a short distance. They offer amenities that, while high quality, are broadly replicable. Private beaches, infinity pools, farm-to-table dining, and world-class spas have become expected features, not differentiators. Guests, while affluent, are increasingly price-sensitive and willing to shift to alternatives when value deteriorates. The commodification of luxury has accelerated. What felt exclusive and rare 20 years ago is now available at dozens of properties within a given region. Differentiation is increasingly difficult. Marketing budgets escalate as properties fight for attention in a crowded marketplace. The economic environment has also shifted. Construction costs have risen faster than room rates in most markets. Labor costs, particularly for skilled hospitality workers, have increased substantially. Regulatory requirements, from environmental compliance to accessibility standards, add expenses that did not exist in earlier decades. Financing structures have changed as well. The era of cheap credit that prevailed through the early 2000s ended with the financial crisis. Lenders now require higher equity contributions and charge higher interest rates for resort projects. This increases the break-even occupancy threshold, making already challenging economics even tighter. The analysis that should happen, but often does not, is simple. Model the worst-case scenario, not the expected case, not the optimistic case. The worst case, that is still plausible within historical precedent. If the project cannot survive that scenario without additional capital injections, it should not be built. If it requires 75% occupancy to break even, and competitors in the market average 65%, the project is likely unviable. If it requires an average daily rate that exceeds the market's demonstrated willingness to pay by more than 10%, the assumptions are flawed. This discipline is difficult to maintain. Optimism is rewarded in real estate development. Visionaries who push forward despite concerns are celebrated when they succeed and quickly forgotten when they fail. Caution is often interpreted as lack of vision or insufficient ambition. The pressure to approve, to proceed, to build is intense. Investors want returns and believe that hospitality, particularly luxury hospitality, offers stable long-term value. Developers want fees that are earned regardless of the project's ultimate success. Lenders want to deploy capital in an environment where high-quality borrowers are scarce. Consultants want to deliver favorable reports that lead to additional engagements. All of these incentives push toward yes. Few incentives push toward no. The person who kills a deal is rarely celebrated, even when proven correct by subsequent events. The organizational dynamics reinforce this bias. Investment committees hear presentations from advocates. The project champion has spent months developing relationships, assembling data, and building consensus. Dissent at the final approval stage is uncomfortable and often ineffective. Due diligence processes, while thorough in examining details, often fail to question fundamental assumptions. Is there actually demand for another luxury resort in this market? Can pricing support the required cost structure? Are occupancy projections realistic given competitive dynamics? These questions are asked, but the answers are often shaped by optimism. Market studies are commissioned from firms with an incentive to produce favorable results. Comparable properties are selected to support the desired conclusion. Projections incorporate assumptions that, while individually defensible, collectively paint an unrealistic picture. The result is a pipeline of luxury projects, many of which will fail for the same structural reasons. High fixed costs that cannot flex with demand, limited pricing power in increasingly competitive markets, revenue potential that cannot sustain the required cost structure. The failure rate is difficult to quantify precisely. Developers and lenders do not publicize failures. Properties that struggle are often quietly sold, refinanced, or repositioned. The data exists in fragments across bankruptcy filings, distressed asset sales, and industry rumors. Anecdotal evidence from hospitality consultants suggests that 30 to 40% of luxury resort projects that opened in the past 15 years have either failed outright or significantly underperformed their original projections. This is not a marginal issue. This is a systemic pattern. The pattern will continue until the cost of failure exceeds the rewards of approval. Until lenders absorb sufficient losses to fundamentally change underwriting standards, until investors demand more realistic projections, until consultants face consequences for overly optimistic feasibility studies. But incentives change slowly. Memory in real estate is short. Markets that experienced distress recover. New investors enter with fresh capital and confidence that they will succeed where others failed. The cycle repeats. Another luxury resort is proposed. The projections look compelling. The design is breathtaking. The approvals are granted. And the same structural forces that doomed previous projects lie waiting, patient and inevitable, in the spreadsheet. The resort didn't fail at hospitality. It failed at existence. The fundamental lesson is uncomfortable. Quality and viability are not the same thing. A resort can be beautiful, well-operated, and beloved by guests while simultaneously being a financial disaster. These outcomes are not contradictory. They are independent variables that happened to align unfavorably. The original vision was noble. Create a property that never compromised, deliver flawless experiences, build something that would set new standards for luxury hospitality. That vision was realized. Guests were delighted. Service exceeded expectations, design won awards, and yet the vision was economically impossible. This is the paradox at the heart of the failure. Success and failure coexisted. The resort succeeded at its stated mission while failing at the unstated requirement of financial sustainability. The question this raises is deeper than real estate. It applies to any endeavor where quality and cost are in tension. How much perfection can be afforded? At what point does the pursuit of excellence become self-defeating? In hospitality, the answer is emerging. Luxury can be delivered at different scales and price points. A boutique hotel with 30 rooms can achieve luxury with manageable costs. A resort with 280 rooms faces dice economies of scale that make luxury prohibitively expensive. The size was part of the problem. Larger resorts require more staff, more infrastructure, more systems. Costs scale faster than revenue. A smaller property can deliver comparable guest experiences with half the operational complexity. Revenue per room may be similar, but total costs are dramatically lower. The optimal size for a luxury resort, based on recent market performance, appears to be between 80 and 150 rooms, large enough to achieve purchasing efficiencies and staffing flexibility, small enough to avoid runaway fixed costs. The failed resort was nearly double that optimal range. The extra 130 rooms did not double revenue. They more than doubled costs. This mismatch was baked into the design. Once construction began, the trajectory was set. The building could not shrink. The systems could not be simplified. The costs were locked in. The failure was not a failure of execution. It was a failure of conception. The question of whether something can be too perfect to exist has been answered. Yes, perfection at unsustainable cost is not perfection. It is indulgence. And indulgence, when it exceeds economic reality, is temporary. The resort stood empty for 14 months. During that time it remained perfect. The architecture was unchanged. The Design was intact. The potential was undimmed. But potential without viability is not an asset. It is a liability. The eventual sale and conversion represented a surrender, a recognition that the original model could not be saved, only replaced. The new model sacrificed perfection for sustainability. Service levels dropped, staffing fell, amenities were simplified, and the property survived, not as a monument to luxury, but as a functional hospitality asset generating modest returns for distributed owners. The dream died. The building lived. That outcome, anticlimactic and unsatisfying, is the reality of markets. They do not reward vision, they reward math. The resort was a testament to what money can build. It was also a reminder of what money cannot sustain. Perfection, it turns out, is expensive, and sometimes it is too expensive to exist. The empty corridors still echo with intention. Someone believed in this place. Committees approved it. Architects designed it. Builders constructed it. Staff operated it. Guests enjoyed it. And the market rejected it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just consistently, month after month, through numbers that would not bend. The lesson is not that luxury is impossible. Luxury exists and thrives in many forms. The lesson is that luxury, like any business, must respect economic limits. Revenue must exceed costs. If it does not, the venture fails, regardless of quality. This particular resort pushed beyond those limits. It was designed for a world where perfection was affordable at scale. That world did not exist. The failure was rational, predictable in hindsight. But hindsight is not available when decisions are made. At the moment of approval, the data supported the project. Models projected success. Experts endorsed the plan. They were wrong, not because they were incompetent, but because they were optimistic. Optimism is necessary to build. Without it, nothing ambitious gets attempted. But optimism unchecked by realism leads to failure. The balance between vision and viability is delicate. This resort fell on the wrong side of that balance. It built for perfection and discovered that perfection, at this scale and cost, was unsustainable. The building stands now under different ownership, serving different guests, operating under different assumptions. The original dream is gone. But the structure remains, proof that beauty can be built and that beauty alone is not enough. Markets are indifferent to dreams. They measure revenue against costs. They deliver verdicts without mercy. This resort received its verdict. The numbers did not work. The model failed. And in that failure lies a question for every ambitious project. Is what we are building sustainable, or are we constructing a monument to inevitable collapse? The resort could not answer that question in time. The spreadsheet answered it instead. And the spreadsheet, patient and precise, always wins.